This is the story of a soldier who, after retirement, set out on his final mission. But this mission wasn't against an enemy. It was for a forgotten dog that no one wanted. The mornings were the hardest for Jack Callahan. He'd wake before dawn, the way the army had trained him decades ago, even though he no longer had anyone waiting for his orders. His little cabin in northern Maine creaked with the sounds of age, the wood popping in the cold, the wind pressing against the windows. But mostly, it was the silence that pressed in on him. He used to hate the noise, the shouting, the hum of helicopters, the constant edge of danger humming through his bones like an electric current. Now he hated the quiet more. At 72, Jack was a man built of scars. His hands bore the rough calluses of years holding rifles and shovels, steering wheels and coffins. His knees ached, his back was crooked, but his eyes were still sharp, pale blue, like a winter sky. They had seen too much and yet still searched for something. His wife had been gone for 10 years. Cancer had taken her quick, before either of them had time to understand the goodbye. The kids had long since built lives of their own. Visits for holidays, the occasional phone call, but nothing steady. Jack didn't blame them. He had raised them to move forward. He just hadn't expected to be left so far behind. Most mornings he shuffled to the kitchen, poured black coffee, and sat at the table staring out the window at the woods. Sometimes he talked out loud, to his wife, to the men he lost, to himself. It made the silence less sharp. That particular morning, he caught himself muttering, "Another day, Jackie boy. Let's see if you can make yourself useful." He said it half as a joke, half as a challenge. He had always believed a man without purpose was a man already gone. But lately, he'd felt like a ghost walking around his own cabin. After finishing his coffee, he pulled on his old army field jacket, frayed at the cuffs but still holding warmth, and drove his battered Ford pickup into town. He didn't have much reason to go most days, but he liked to walk through the farmer's market, pick up groceries, and see faces that reminded him he still lived in a world with people. That day, though, he drove past the market. His hands turned the wheel almost on their own, guiding him to the county animal shelter. Jack didn't know why he went. Maybe it was the silence gnawing at him, or the way his chest had felt heavy that morning, like he was running out of time and didn't even know for what. The shelter smelled of bleach and wet fur. Rows of kennels stretched down a narrow hallway, each cage holding eyes that followed him as he walked. Puppies yipped, younger dogs wagged their tails eagerly, voices rising in a chorus of hope. Jack kept walking. At the very end of the row, in a kennel half in shadow, lay a dog that didn't even bother to lift its head. A big shepherd mix, gray fur around the muzzle, ribs showing beneath a thinning coat. The tag on the gate read, "Max, age 12, surrendered." Jack crouched down slowly, his knees cracking like old floorboards. "Hey, fella," he said, his voice soft. One ear twitched, and then, after a long pause, the dog raised his head. His eyes were cloudy, but there was still something there, a question maybe, or a memory. The shelter worker walked up behind Jack, carrying a clipboard. "That one? He's been here a while. Nobody wants the seniors. Most folks want puppies or young dogs. He's not going to be an easy one." Jack didn't answer right away. He just stared at the dog, and the dog stared back. For a moment, it felt like they were measuring each other. Two old soldiers, both worn down by years, wondering if there was still something left to fight for. Finally, Jack straightened, his back stiff. He looked at the worker. "I'll take him." The worker blinked. "Sir, you sure? He's 12. Arthritis. Needs meds. Probably doesn't have many years left." Jack's pale blue eyes hardened, though his voice stayed calm. "Neither do I." The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. And just like that, Jack Callahan, veteran widower, man searching for a mission, found one. Or maybe it had found him. Max didn't wag his tail when they opened the kennel. He didn't jump or bark. He just walked out slowly, quietly, and stood by Jack's side as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Jack reached down, resting a hand on the dog's bony shoulders. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel empty, felt full. And though neither of them knew it yet, this would be Jack's final mission. A mission not of war, but of love. The adoption paperwork didn't take long, but for Jack, it felt like a lifetime. He wasn't used to signing so many forms anymore. Most of his bills were paid automatically, and anything else he tended to ignore until it demanded his attention. But this he signed with a strange sense of gravity, like a soldier receiving his orders. When the last sheet was handed over, the shelter worker gave him a tight smile. "You're doing a good thing. Not many folks would take in an old boy like him." Jack didn't answer right away. He was watching Max, who stood quietly at the end of a frayed leash. The dog's head hung low, tail still, body language cautious but not resistant. It was as if Max had already accepted disappointment as a way of life. "Let's get you home, partner," Jack muttered, more to himself than to the dog. They walked out to the truck together. Jack opened the passenger side door, half expecting the dog to balk, but Max surprised him. With deliberate slowness, he stepped up onto the floorboard, then the seat, and curled himself as small as his old bones allowed. No fuss, no noise, just resignation. Jack climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. The old Ford rumbled, coughing once before settling into a steady growl. For the first few miles, neither of them moved. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the rattle of loose change in a cup holder. Jack's eyes kept drifting toward the passenger seat. Max was pressed against the door, staring out the window, his reflection ghosted against the glass. His cloudy eyes didn't show fear, more like a deep weariness. Jack knew that look. He'd seen it on the faces of men in his platoon during the long stretches between firefights. Men who had survived too much, carrying more weight than they could set down. "You and me both, boy," Jack said quietly. Max's ear flicked, a tiny acknowledgement, but he didn't turn his head. The road home wound through thick pine forests, sun filtering in shards through the canopy. Summer insects buzzed, and in the distance, a hawk cried out. Jack always loved the stretch, the way the land felt wide and untouched, like it held secrets older than any man. Halfway home, he stopped at the gas station in town. He bought a bag of kibble, a couple of cans of wet food, and a worn leather collar from the small pet aisle. It wasn't much, but it felt like the right start. When he returned to the truck, Max was sitting up, watching him. Jack held up the bag of food. "Got you something, old-timer." The dog didn't react much, but when Jack climbed in and set the bag down, Max nosed it lightly, as though confirming this man truly meant to keep him. The rest of the drive was different. Max didn't curl back into the door. Instead, he shifted closer, inch by inch, until his head rested lightly on the cracked leather of the armrest between them. Jack didn't smile often these days. His face had settled into lines of sternness over the years, the kind that came from too much discipline and too little laughter. But in that moment, a flicker of something softened him. "Yeah," he whispered, eyes on the road. "I think we'll do all right." When they finally pulled into the gravel driveway of Jack's cabin, the forest greeted them with the rustle of trees and the distant call of loons from the lake. The cabin sat steady and weathered, its porch sagging slightly but still standing proud. Jack got out first, then opened the passenger door. Max hesitated, sniffing the air, then carefully climbed down. His paws pressed into the gravel, stiff at first but steadying as he moved. He stood beside Jack, not pulling away, not surging forward, just waiting. Jack reached down and patted his side. "Welcome home, Max." Inside, the cabin was simple. A wood stove, a threadbare couch, shelves lined with books and framed photos, his wife smiling in younger days, his kids in uniforms at graduations, his own army unit grinning in a desert half a world away. Max sniffed the air, padding slowly through the small space. He stopped at the hearth, turned once in a circle, and lay down with a heavy sigh. Jack lowered himself into the armchair across from him. He poured a measure of whiskey into a chipped glass, though he didn't drink it right away. He just sat, listening to the sound of a dog breathing in his home for the first time. The silence felt different now, not gone but shared. Jack leaned back, exhaling long and slow. For the first time in years, he wasn't just passing another day. He was beginning something that mattered. The first night was restless. Max didn't whine, didn't bark, but Jack could hear him shifting on the hearth. Every time the old dog moved, his nails clicked against the wood floor, sharp little reminders that Jack wasn't alone anymore. Jack himself wasn't much of a sleeper these days. The nightmares came and went like unwelcome visitors, slamming the door of his mind open at the worst hours. Sometimes it was the desert, the orange glow, the ringing in his ears, the sand caked in his teeth. Other times it was the cold hospital room where he'd held his wife's hand for the last time. That night, when the dreams came, he woke with a start, chest heaving. His eyes darted around the dark cabin until they landed on the faint outline of Max, lying just a few feet away. The dog raised his head, ears twitching, and gave a soft huff through his nose. No judgment, no pity, just acknowledgement. "Yeah," Jack whispered, rubbing his face. "I'm still here too." In the morning, they fell into a rhythm of trial and error. Jack poured kibble into an old ceramic bowl he hadn't used in years. Max ate slowly, carefully, like every bite had to be earned. Jack made a mental note to add canned food to soften it. His own teeth weren't what they used to be, and he figured Max's weren't either. After breakfast, they stepped outside. Jack leaned on the porch rail while Max took hesitant steps down into the yard. The dog sniffed the damp earth, lifted his leg against a pine tree, and then simply stood, nose raised, taking in the air. "You'll like it here," Jack said. "Plenty of space, quiet, nobody to bother us." The words felt strange. "Not me." Max turned his head slightly at the sound of Jack's voice, then went back to exploring. They tried a short walk down the dirt road. Jack carried a cane these days, more for balance than necessity, but the gravel was uneven and slowed him down. Max didn't mind. His gait was stiff, his hips clearly aching, but he never pulled ahead. He stayed. When they got back, Jack filled a metal water dish on the porch. He lowered himself into the rocking chair, the one his wife had used to sit in during summer evenings, and watched Max settle at his feet. The dog stretched out with a groan, sighing deep as though the weight of years was finally softening. Jack reached down and ran a hand along the rough fur of his neck. Max didn't flinch, didn't move away. He just closed his eyes. "Guess we're both worn out," Jack said softly. For the next few days, the house grew less empty. Jack found himself talking out loud more, not just muttering into the silence, but actually speaking. About the weather, about the errands he needed to run, about memories that surfaced like old photographs. Max never answered, of course, but he listened. His eyes would follow Jack's movements, and sometimes, when Jack's voice cracked, the dog would inch closer, pressing against his leg as though to steady him. On the fourth day, Jack sat at the kitchen table sorting through a stack of unopened mail. He didn't care much for bills and notices anymore, but one letter caught his eye, a flyer for the local veterans support group. He'd thrown out a dozen like it before, but this time his gaze lingered. "Think we should go, Max?" he asked, glancing down. The dog was lying under the table, paws crossed, eyes half closed. At the sound of his name, he gave a single thump of his tail. Jack chuckled. "Not much of an answer, but it's more than I had yesterday." That night, as Jack got ready for bed, he paused by the hearth. He spread an old blanket on the floor, folding it double to cushion Max's joints. The dog circled twice, then lay down with a grunt, resting his head on his paws. Jack stood for a moment studying the sight. His cabin had held shadows for so long, but now, in the soft lamplight, it held something else too. Presence. He switched off the lamp and climbed into bed. For the first time in years, Jack fell asleep without dread pressing on his chest. And when the nightmares came, they didn't drag him under quite as far. Because when he startled awake in the dark, there was a sound he hadn't heard in a long, long time. Steady breathing, deep and reassuring, from a companion who expected nothing except to be near. The September mornings were cooler now, the Georgia heat retreating at last. Jack rose early, as he always did, fixing coffee in the dented percolator while Max shuffled behind him, nails tapping the wood floor like a slow metronome. It had been weeks since Jack brought Max home, and already the dog had carved out a place in the rhythm of the cabin. Jack found himself cooking 2 breakfasts, one for himself, one soft and gentle for Max's tired teeth. He found himself saving half his chair on the porch, not for company he no longer had, but for the broad, graying body stretched across the planks. They walked together every day, though walk was generous. It was more of a shuffle, both of them stubbornly refusing to admit their joints ached. Jack leaned on his cane. Max leaned into the air, both finding pace in each other's slowness. But the cracks were showing. Max stumbled more often now. Once, his back legs gave way halfway down the dirt road. He tried to keep going, tried to act like it hadn't happened. But Jack saw the truth in the dog's eyes. The quiet embarrassment of a soldier who couldn't carry his pack anymore. Jack knelt beside him, breathing hard himself. He rested a hand on Max's shoulder. Don't worry about it, old man. Happens to the best of us. Max licked his wrist, then leaned against him until they managed to get upright together. At night, Jack sometimes heard Max whimper in his sleep. Not sharp yelps, but the low, muffled sounds of dreams gone sour. Jack knew the sound too well. He'd made it himself enough nights. His own chest torn by memories he couldn't outrun. One evening, he slid down from his bed to the floor, settling beside Max's blanket. He lay there on the hardwood, one arm draped over the old dog's back, until both their breathing slowed into something closer to peace. That was when Jack realized it. Max wasn't just a dog he'd rescued. He was a mirror. Every limp, every scar, every haunted glance at nothing, Jack saw himself. And in that reflection, he found something unexpected, a reason to keep going. But still, doubts lingered. In the quiet of his porch, Jack stared at the veteran support flyer still pinned to his fridge. The meetings were on Tuesdays at the Legion Hall in town. He hadn't gone. Couldn't quite make himself. What if they look at me the way folks looked at you? Jack asked one night, scratching Max's ears. Like I've had my time. Like I'm too worn out to matter. Max only leaned into his touch, eyes soft, body warm against Jack's leg. Yeah, Jack murmured. Guess it doesn't matter to you, huh? The days shortened, the nights grew colder. Jack bought a thicker blanket for Max, though more often than not the dog ended up on Jack's rug, closer to the stove. The cabin no longer felt so empty, but Jack couldn't ignore the truth. Max's time was limited. The thought gnawed at him. Another loss. Another hole opening up in a heart already riddled with them. But then, one crisp morning, Max surprised him. They'd gone down the road, slower than ever, when a truck rattled past. The driver slowed, window down. That your dog, Harper? It was his neighbor, Frank, who lived a mile down. Jack nodded. Yeah, found him at the shelter. Frank gave a low whistle. That's a good thing you did. He looks happy. Looks like he's got a job again. Jack glanced at Max, who was sitting tall beside him, chest out, as if the words had reached him. For a moment, Jack saw not the frail, limping senior, but the soldier still inside him. Yeah, Jack said quietly. He does. As the truck pulled away, Jack stood a little straighter himself. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe this was their mission now, not to outlast the years, but to make them count. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt the faintest flicker of pride. The Legion Hall smelled the same as it always had. Old wood, coffee brewed too long, a faint trace of cigarette smoke clinging to the walls. Jack hadn't set foot in the place in years. Too many ghosts, too many questions he didn't want to answer. But Max was there, padding slowly at his side, and that made all the difference. It had started with a flyer. Again, same one pinned to his fridge, staring him down each morning. He'd ignored it for months. Then, one Tuesday, he looked at Max and said, "All right, let's give it a shot." The drive into town was quiet. Jack's hands gripped the wheel tighter than they needed to. But whenever he glanced right, there was Max, his big head resting on the passenger seat like he belonged there. Steadied him. When they stepped inside, heads turned. A few old-timers at the back gave nods of recognition. Others just stared at Max. "Don't mind us," Jack muttered, almost turning around. But Max tugged forward gently on the leash, like he knew where they belonged. A man in his 60s stood at the coffee urn, tall and broad with a cane at his side. "That your dog?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Yeah. Name's Max, got him from the shelter." The man's expression softened. "Good on you. Old dogs don't get many second chances." He reached out a hand, letting Max sniff before scratching under his chin. "Looks like you saved each other." Jack swallowed. "Something like that." They found seats in the circle of folding chairs. Jack hated circles, made him feel exposed. But Max flopped down at his boots, tail thumping once before settling. The dog's calm seeped into Jack like a slow warmth. When it came his turn to speak, Jack hesitated. His throat went tight, words stuck like gravel. He looked down at Max, who was gazing up at him with those steady brown eyes. No judgment, no pressure, just trust. "I'm Jack Harper," he said finally, voice low. "Army. Retired a long time now. Thought I was done with missions, but I guess I've got one more. Looking after him." He patted Max's side. "Guess he's looking after me too." The room was quiet. Then someone across the circle, a woman with silver hair cropped close, said, "That's a good mission, Jack. The best one there is." The knot in Jack's chest loosened, just a little. He hadn't expected kindness. He sure hadn't expected belonging. But as the night went on, he found himself listening, even sharing a little. On the drive home, the stars stretched wide above the road. Jack glanced at Max, who had fallen asleep with his chin on the seat. "Not bad, huh?" Jack said softly. "Guess we both made it through." Back at the cabin, Jack stoked the fire and lowered himself into his chair. Max curled up close, his body pressing against Jack's leg, warm and steady. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like he was carrying the weight alone. The cracks were still there, but through them, something new was seeping in light. And though he didn't say it out loud, Jack knew. This dog hadn't just saved his evening. He was saving his life. The first snow came early that year, light flakes drifting over the Georgia pines, dusting the cabin roof in white. Jack was splitting wood when he heard it. A strange sound from inside. Not the steady creak of Max shifting on his rug, but a low, strangled whine. He dropped the axe and rushed in. Max was on the floor by the stove, sides heaving, paws twitching against the boards. His eyes were half closed, his breath shallow and uneven. For a heartbeat, Jack's chest froze. He'd seen this before. Too many brothers in arms, their bodies betraying them while he could only watch. "Max!" Jack dropped to his knees, hands trembling as he stroked the dog's chest. "Stay with me, boy. Stay." Max's gaze flicked toward him, cloudy but searching. He tried to lift his head, but it sank back down. Jack didn't think, he just moved. He grabbed a blanket, wrapped Max gently, and carried him to the truck. His knees screamed in protest, his back threatened to give, but he didn't stop. Not now. Not when it mattered. The drive into town was a blur of snow and panic. Jack's knuckles whitened on the wheel. He kept talking, filling the cab with a voice that shook more than he wanted to admit. "You're not done yet, old man. Hear me? You and me, we've got more miles left." At the vet's office, the nurse rushed Max to the back while Jack stood, useless and hollow, in the waiting room. He stared at the posters on the walls. Bright dogs with shiny coats, all promise and health. Nothing like the frail body he just carried in. Minutes stretched like hours. Jack's chest ached, the way it used to before going on patrol. The waiting, the helplessness. Finally, the vet appeared. A young woman, kind-eyed but serious. "He had a seizure," she explained gently. "At his age, it's not uncommon. We've stabilized him for now, but, Jack, he's fragile. You should prepare for more of these." The words hit like a punch. Prepare. As if he hadn't been preparing for loss his entire life. "Can I see him?" Jack asked, voice tight. She nodded. Max lay on a padded table, a blanket tucked around him. His eyes fluttered open as Jack approached, and a faint thump of his tail greeted him. Jack's throat closed. "Hey, soldier," he whispered, brushing a hand over Max's head. "Gave me a hell of a scare there." Max leaned weakly into his touch, and that was enough. That was everything. On the drive home, Max lay quiet but steady in the passenger seat. Jack kept glancing over, as though sheer will could keep him breathing. Back at the cabin, Jack built the fire higher, set out water, and laid down beside Max on the rug. He didn't sleep, just kept a hand resting on the dog's side, counting each rise and fall. In the silence of that long night, Jack realized something. He wasn't afraid for himself anymore. He was afraid of losing the only thing that had pulled him back from the edge. And as the firelight flickered across the walls, he made a promise, whispered into the stillness, barely more than breath. "As long as you're here, Max, I'll be here too. You don't fight alone." The morning after the scare, Jack brewed coffee but barely touched it. His eyes kept drifting to Max, who slept near the fire, chest rising and falling in that slow, uneven rhythm that made Jack's heart stumble with each pause. He'd been told to prepare. He'd heard those words before in hospital tents half a world away. But preparation never softened the blow. Instead, Jack decided he would do what soldiers always did when faced with the impossible: adapt, improvise, carry on. So he learned. He drove back to the vet, not because Max needed a checkup that day, but because Jack needed answers. He sat across from Dr. Ellis, a patient woman who spoke plainly, without pity. "Senior dogs need adjustments," she explained. "Softer food for the teeth, joint supplements, a warmer bed for those old bones. Seizures may come again, but keeping him comfortable, calm, and loved, that's the mission now." Jack nodded, taking notes like a recruit on his first day. He hated feeling green again, hated the sting of helplessness, but he wrote down every word. Back at the cabin, he made changes. He laid rugs across the slick spots on the floor so Max wouldn't slip. He dragged his mattress to the living room, closer to the fire, so he could sleep beside the dog on colder nights. He cooked chicken and rice, softer than kibble, watching Max eat with a hunger that gave Jack hope. It was work, constant and humbling, but Jack didn't mind. For years he'd felt useless. A soldier retired, a man sidelined by his own memories. But now every task had purpose. Every pill slipped into food. Every careful step down the porch stairs. Every midnight check of Max's breathing. It all mattered. And strangely, as he gave more, he found pieces of himself returning. His hands, once restless with ghosts, grew steady when brushing Max's coat. His nights, once fractured by nightmares, grew softer with the weight of Max curled against him. The cabin, once hollow, now pulsed with a rhythm of shared survival. One evening, Jack sat on the porch, the air sharp with pine and frost. Max rested at his feet, eyes half shut, ears twitching at the distant call of owls. "You know," Jack said quietly, "they told me I was done. Too old to matter. Too broken to fix." He leaned forward, resting a hand on Max's back. "But you don't see it that way, do you?" Max lifted his head, pressed his muzzle against Jack's knee, and sighed. It wasn't words, but it was enough. Jack felt something swell in his chest, something he hadn't allowed in years. Peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he finally wasn't fighting it alone. That night, as he lay on the rug with Max beside him, Jack whispered into the dark, "Maybe this is the mission I was meant to have all along. Not to save the world, just to save you, and let you save me right back." And for the first time in a long time, he slept without waking in terror. Winter crept in with quiet persistence, coating the pines in frost and leaving breath visible in the air. Jack bundled Max in an old army blanket whenever they stepped outside. The dog didn't mind the cold much. His spirit seemed to burn warmer than his frail body, but Jack wasn't taking chances anymore. Most days, they stayed close to the cabin. A slow shuffle to the mailbox, a nap by the fire, the simple rhythm of two old souls learning to live gently. But one morning, Jack looked at Max and thought, "We need to go further. One more mission." So he loaded Max carefully into the truck, laying the blanket across the seat, and set out for town. The drive was slow, cautious on the icy roads. Max sat upright at first, watching the trees whip past, nose pressed to the glass. Then, when the engine's hum settled into rhythm, he curled his head against Jack's arm, as if to say, "I trust you. Lead the way." They stopped first at the Legion Hall. Jack hadn't planned it, but something in him wanted to show Max off, not as a dog he'd rescued, but as a partner who had rescued him right back. When he walked in, the chatter softened. Max ambled beside him, tail wagging faintly, and a few men reached down to greet him. "Good to see you, Harper," one said. "And the old soldier, too." Jack chuckled, pride catching in his throat. Yeah, he's still got some fight left. They stayed for coffee. Max stretched across Jack's boots like a living anchor. Jack spoke a little more than usual, shared a memory or two he'd once kept buried. Somehow, It was easier with Max there, his steady breathing reminding Jack he wasn't alone. Afterward, Jack drove to the park on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a patch of grass with a few benches and a frozen pond. He lifted Max gently from the truck, setting him on the ground. The dog sniffed the air, tail lifting, and took a few stiff steps before easing into something like a trot. His paws crunched the frost. His nose dug into patches of grass, and for a moment, he looked like the pup he must have been long ago. Jack followed slowly, cane in hand, watching with a smile that hurt because it was so rare. An elderly couple passed by, pausing to admire Max. "He's beautiful," the woman said. Jack nodded. "Yeah, best damn thing that's happened to me." When Max tired, Jack sat on a bench and lifted the dog onto his lap, ignoring the protest of his knees. Together, they watched the pond catch the afternoon sun, the ice gleaming like glass. Jack stroked Max's ears and whispered, "One more journey, huh? Doesn't matter where it ends, as long as we walk it together." The words surprised him. He hadn't meant to say them out loud, but Max pressed closer, eyes closing, as if sealing a pact. On the drive home, Jack realized something. He wasn't dreading the end anymore. Not as much, because it wasn't about how much time they had left. It was about what they did with it. And in that quiet truck, with Max's head heavy on his arm, Jack felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days grew shorter, and so did Max's strength. What had once been a steady shuffle became a struggle. Some mornings, he didn't want to rise at all. Jack would kneel beside him, whispering encouragement like he had to young soldiers in the field. "Easy now, one step at a time. That's it, good boy. I've got you." But each day, Jack felt it more clearly, the weight of borrowed time. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Max tried to climb onto the rug but stumbled, legs collapsing beneath him. Jack caught him just in time, lowering him gently to the floor. Max looked up, eyes clouded but apologetic, as though ashamed of failing. Jack pressed his forehead to the dog's. "No, don't you dare be sorry. You've carried me farther than I ever thought I'd go." His voice broke on the words, and he didn't bother hiding it. From that night on, Jack adjusted even more. He built ramps out of scrap wood for the porch steps. He carried Max to the truck instead of letting him climb. He set alarms to give medicine on time, careful with each pill as though it were a bullet loaded with hope. The vet visits became more frequent. Dr. Ellis was kind but honest. "He's in his twilight, Jack. What matters now is comfort, love, letting him feel safe." Jack nodded, throat tight. He understood. He'd seen Twilight in Men 2, The Last Watch, the final mission. And he knew his orders: be there, hold steady, don't let him walk out alone. Nights were the hardest. Jack would wake to Max's restless breathing, the small whimpers that sounded like dreams gone bad. He'd lay on the rug, hand resting on Max's chest, whispering, "You're safe, buddy. I'm right here, always." Sometimes, when the cabin was quiet and the fire burned low, Jack caught himself praying. Not for more time, though he wanted it desperately, but for Max to know without a doubt that he was loved. One frosty morning, Jack carried Max outside, blanket wrapped around his body. They sat on the porch together, watching the sunrise spill over the pines. "You see that?" Jack whispered. "That's another day you gave me. Another day I wouldn't have had without you." Max shifted weakly, resting his head against Jack's chest. His eyes fluttered shut, his body heavy with weariness, but his tail gave one soft thump. Jack's own eyes burned. He pressed a kiss to the dog's graying head. "You've done enough, soldier," he murmured. "More than enough." The truth pressed down like the winter sky. The end was near, and Jack, though broken by the thought, made a silent promise. When that day came, Max would not face it alone. The call came on a gray afternoon, though Jack had already known it was coming. Max hadn't eaten in 2 days. He barely lifted his head anymore. His breaths were shallow, each one like a hill too steep to climb. Jack sat beside him on the rug, stroking his ears. "You don't have to keep fighting for me, buddy," he whispered. "You've already won." But when Max's eyes met his, Jack felt the same unspoken vow that had carried them both through so many nights. "I'm with you until the end." At the vet's office, Dr. Ellis greeted him softly. She didn't need to explain. Jack had seen the truth in war, and he saw it here. The kindest mission was also the hardest. She gave him time. Time Jack filled with memory. He crouched close, his face buried in Max's fur, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and pine that had soaked into the dog's coat. "You remember that first day?" Jack murmured. "You in that shelter, no one wanting you. I didn't know it then, but you were my last mission. The one that mattered most." Max's tail flicked once, faint but sure. Jack felt his chest crack wide open. "You saved me, soldier. You saved me in ways I'll never be able to say out loud. But you know, I think you've always known." When the time came, Jack held Max's head in his hands. He whispered steady, like a commander seeing a man home. "You're not alone. Not now, not ever. Rest easy." The injection was quick, merciful. Jack felt the last breath leave against his palms, warm fading to stillness. His body shook, but he kept whispering, kept stroking Max's fur, until the silence filled the room. For a long while, Jack couldn't move. The world felt too sharp, too empty. But then he remembered his promise. "You won't walk out alone." So he stayed. He stayed until the sun dipped behind the trees, until the last light left the sky. When he finally carried Max out to the truck, wrapped in the same army blanket, the weight was both unbearable and holy. Back at the cabin, Jack dug with trembling hands, the cold earth biting his skin. He buried Max beneath the pines, a place where the sunrise would touch him first each morning. He placed the old leash atop the mound, then saluted, hand trembling but firm. "Mission complete, soldier." His voice cracked, but his chest held steady. "You did good. You did so damn good." That night, the cabin was unbearably quiet. Jack sat by the fire, staring at the empty rug, the missing weight against his leg. For a while, he thought the emptiness would swallow him whole. But then he remembered the last look in Max's eyes. Steady, loyal, unafraid. And Jack realized Max hadn't left him weaker. He'd left him stronger. The mission wasn't over. Not yet. Weeks passed. The cabin still felt hollow without the steady rhythm of paws on the floorboards, without the weight of Max's head pressing against his knee. Jack had always thought silence was his worst enemy. But now he learned something new. Silence could also be a place to listen. And in that quiet, he heard Max everywhere. He heard him in the crunch of pine needles under his boots, in the crackle of the firewood, in the low wind threading through the trees. He heard him in memory, that first wag of the tail, that final flicker of loyalty in those deep brown eyes. Grief lived beside him now, but it wasn't the same kind of grief he'd carried from the war. This grief had weight, but it also had warmth. It wasn't just loss. It was proof of love. Jack started walking into town more often. At first, it was just to keep moving. But one afternoon, he passed by the shelter, the same one where he'd found Max all those years ago. He froze at the door. The sound of barking inside tugged at something in his chest. He wasn't ready, not yet, but he felt a pull all the same. Dr. Ellis spotted him when she stepped out to her car. She walked over, giving him the kind of smile people reserve for someone carrying invisible weight. "Just looking?" she asked gently. Jack nodded. His throat worked, but no words came. She didn't push. She just placed a hand on his shoulder. "You gave Max more than most dogs ever get. He had a soldier, a home, a purpose. That matters, Jack. It matters more than you know." That night, Jack sat on the porch, staring at the stars. For years, the darkness had been a battlefield for him, a place where memories circled like vultures. But now he found something else in the night sky. Max had taught him that endings didn't have to be empty, that love could last even when the body was gone. Jack picked up a notebook and began to write. At first, it was just fragments, memories, promises, pieces of a story he didn't want to lose. Then it grew into more. Stories about Max, stories about other dogs he'd known, soldiers he'd served with, moments of loyalty that had saved lives in the smallest, fiercest ways. Writing became his new mission. Sharing Max's story meant Max never really left. Months later, when the shelter called asking if he'd come help with a fundraiser, Jack said yes. Standing there, surrounded by wagging tails and hopeful eyes, he didn't feel broken anymore. He felt ready. He didn't take another dog home that day, but he knew he would someday. Not to replace Max, no one ever could, but to honor him. To keep carrying forward the love Max had given so freely. On the porch that evening, as the sun set over the trees, Jack raised his glass of iced tea toward the little grave under the pines. "To my best soldier," he said softly, "mission never ends, buddy. You'll always be with me." And for the first time in decades, Jack felt peace settle deep in his bones. Not because the war inside him was over, wars like his never truly ended, but because he'd finally found a way to carry it differently. With loyalty, with love, with Max.